My name is Liza Moorhead. I'm the magazine's editor-in-chief. The Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies has been publishing Metroscape for more than 20 years. And this year we decided to start hosting events like this one this morning, where we can dig deeper into one of the stories and talk to people who are closely involved in the issues that we discuss in the story. The feature of today's panel discussion is exploring the reality of federal disinvestment in Skamania County. But before we start the presentation, I'd like to introduce you to other content in this summer's magazine. In Atlas, we look at health data to see how cities in the Portland metropolitan region compare to peer cities across the country. We also introduce the Institute's new Social Vulnerability Index. Several of the articles in this issue explore the ways that population growth is changing local communities. In Landscape, we look at how the small community of Happy Valley is changing its physical footprint to accommodate rapid population growth. We also talked to the mayor of Vancouver about the housing crisis and how it's changing the way that people see the city's role in affordable housing and homelessness. Missing middle housing often comes up in conversations about density, population growth, and neighborhood character. However, it represents a tiny fraction of the new housing being developed across our region. We unpack this issue and what communities can do to accommodate the small-scale development in the back anchor. And finally, in indicators, we look at another growing population, urban coyotes. Reported coyote sightings have increased dramatically in the past 8 years, and we explore why that is. We have advanced copies of the issue available today, and the new content will be released on our website this week. Now I'd like to introduce Avon Moore. Avon is the author of the lead article, Whither Skamania? She just completed her first year in Coupa's Master of Urban and Regional Planning program and is a graduate research assistant for Metroscape, although that doesn't really capture her role since in the year that she's been working with us, we have had her produce a lot of the content, and she has done a great job. Here's Avon.
Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a great panel discussion. I wanted to set it up with some background on the subject, which is the county of Skamania, Washington. Like many rural counties, it faces difficulties in maintaining services and generating jobs for residents. And so our panelists have graciously come all the way down this morning in order to explore this topic, offer specific history of how Skamania County got to where it is, and talk about potential solutions to its problems. Skamania is officially, for purposes of the U.S. Census Bureau, considered part of the Portland-Vancouver-Hillsborough MSA, which means that for Census Bureau purposes, it's socially and economically integrated with these urban cores. It sits on the Columbia River. It's just east of Clark County, and it is about 80% national forest. What that means, practically speaking, is that Skamania County has 0.5% of the population of the MSA, but it actually is 25% of the total area in terms of square mileage, which is really interesting. The Gifford Pinchot is one of the reasons for this. Another reason is that there's the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area, which covers much of the Gorge area, and the actual urban areas are strung along the Columbia River. You've got North Bonneville, you've got Stevenson, Carson, and Home Valley. 80% Gifford Pinchot National Forest, 10% private timberland, and then 8% state-owned land in the county, much of which is either park or timber. Some more numbers about Skamania County. It's got a current residence population of about 12,000. 88% of the county is non-Hispanic white. 4.6 is foreign-born. About 9 out of 10 have high school degrees. 1 in 5 have a bachelor's degree. 1 in 10 residents is a veteran, and perhaps relatedly, 11% of the county's residents are disabled. 13.5% are living in poverty. Skamania County's problems developed as the timber industry declined precipitously in the 1990s. The two biggest factors in this were the introduction of conservation limits on logging activity and the mechanization of the timber industry. The job market is now dominated by the comparatively low-paid and seasonal food, beverage, and tourism industries. And if you look at this graph, that's the light blue line up there on the top. That's leisure and hospitality jobs. You can see also, it's not super easy to pick out, but you can see government jobs have been trending downward just in the last several years. And the reason is partly to do with SRS. In 2000, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden negotiated SRS, the Secure Rural Schools Program, which distributes federal funding to former timber counties. Skamania relied on this annual appropriation to help fund schools, county services, and some of the activities that are carried out on federal land, like search and rescue. But after the first several years of this, support for SRS declined, and the disbursements became irregular. You can see in the background bar graph, these are SRS payments total to the county as they came in each year. The loss of SRS was particularly noticeable in the county's 4 school districts. The Carson Middle School was closed and remains so, despite 2 levies passed by the Stevenson-Carson School District in 2012 and 2017 that help maintain programs at other schools. This graph shows the SRS funds that are available to the county's current expense fund. That's the money that the county is able to use flexibly. They're shown in the federal fiscal year for which they were approved, and they're not adjusted for inflation. So when you look at this, you can imagine it being a little higher, comparatively speaking, in the earlier years. SRS wasn't renewed for fiscal year 2016, which is why that number is so small. But when SRS doesn't come in, there's a smaller payment that kicks in that's based on timber receipts, which is why there's something there at all. Fortunately, Congress just passed a spending bill in March of this year that included retroactive payments for fiscal year 17, and the money was dispersed just in May. What that means for the county is that on top of its approved expense budget of $13 million for this year, it now has an additional $1.5 million to work with. So they're figuring out what to do with that money. So to explore all of these issues in further depth, we have panelists. And I think instead of introducing you myself, what I'm actually going to do is ask you to come up and take your places here and just introduce yourself with your name and any other background information that you would like the audience to know. Pat, probably you should start since you're closest.
My name is Pat Albaugh. I'm the director of the Port of Skamania County. Been the director for 2 years. Worked for ports in Oregon for about 10 years, and mostly private sector before that.
I'm Scott Bailey. I'm the regional economist for the Washington Employment Security Department covering Southwest Washington, and I've done that for 28 years, but I don't live in Skamania County. I live in Portland.
My name is Kari Fagerness. I'm the executive director for Skamania Economic Development Council. I've worked for the EDC for since 2010, And prior to that, I worked in private and public sector as planning and environmental policy planner for Skamania County and private sector.
Good morning. My name is Tom Lannon. I'm County Commissioner for District 2 in Skamania County. I've been at that 1 year, 6 months, and 23 days. Before that, I had been retired for 10 years, and before that, I spent 35 years in the private sector.
So Liza Moorhead is going to do the moderation for this part, so she'll come up and start asking you questions, and after that, then we'll open it up to the floor.
Thank you, Avon. And thank you all for joining us. I think that everyone should appreciate that since you came from Skamania County, we started this event a little bit later, which I know is what every single person who ever comes to one of my events wants to do, except for me. So there are multiple reasons to thank you today. If you could just start by each person talking a little bit about what do you see as Skamania County's biggest challenge right now?
Okay. Pardon me. And this is from the county commissioner's standpoint relative to current expense budget, is money. We have been stressed for a number of years. Back in 2010, the commissioners borrowed $2.5 million to make payroll. At that point, there weren't any reserves. We've recovered from that in terms of stabilizing staff. We've gone from 250 employees in 2008. Today, we're down to about 160. So services are stressed, and a lot of our infrastructure is in need of work. So we have to be very judicious in how we apply funds. This delivery of SRS money for this year was absolutely critical. It's like having oxygen for the next 2 years. So I think it is revenue stream and then responsible management of those funds.
My next. So from an economic development standpoint, what we hear, we work very closely with the private sector businesses as well as our public sector partners. And what we hear mostly from the businesses are some pretty significant challenges with workforce. We have I know that's not uncommon in areas throughout the United States, but we have a small population base. And so our businesses are constantly struggling to find workforce to cook food, to run equipment in our manufacturing sectors. So it's a big challenge. There's quite a bit of turnover, and we also have a significant challenge right now with housing and making sure that the workers and the people that we have running the equipment and cooking the food and doing whatever else is necessary to help those businesses be successful, that they have a place to live and they don't have to travel too far in order to do that.
Sure. So as from the port's perspective, we suffer from kind of a lack of infrastructure, lack of land base. We don't have any available properties. We're about 100% occupied, certainly in our commercial and light industrial. We don't have the capital in order to build additional. We do have some available land that's been undeveloped, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other part of the infrastructure that we're missing is the city of Stevenson. Their sewer plant is at capacity, or actually they're under an administrative order from the Department of Health or ecology, I guess. And there's a moratorium on any additional commercial hookups, so we're not allowed to do anything within the city of Stevenson, which is the county seat and our largest city. Well, there's only 2 cities in the entire county, so North Bonneville and Stevenson. And we also are maxed out on power. So we have the port manages county property up in Stabler, was the former Wind River Nursery from the Forest Service. Had one of the largest tree nurseries on the West Coast, and we manage that, and we're trying to make a business park out of it. That we've maxed out the power to that area. We had a business in what was the processing center of the nursery, and they could only utilize 25% of the building because they didn't have additional power to utilize the other side. So, and then also in North Bonneville, we have an undeveloped industrial park. It's 42 acres, and there's no power to actually turn on the transformers. So we have infrastructure needs and land and also, again, capital for building buildings. And an example would be, we get roughly 220,000, 200 to 40,000 a year in property taxes. And ports typically take their property taxes and they put that towards capital investments. Our nearest example would be the Port of Camas-Washougal. They get $2.5 million a year. So if we had $2.5 million a year, we could be building, light industrial commercial buildings, about 250,000. Really, it's hard to leverage that amount of money. It just takes a long time to fully utilize that money.
So I put myself last because I'm sort of the outsider, and I think it's important to hear the very specific local issues. But as an outsider, I want to say that perspective I have is that, well, every county in this country is facing pretty substantial challenges. And many of the themes here, while they're specific, they play up in specific ways in Skamania. You hear housing, that's huge everywhere. Infrastructure, huge everywhere. And in terms of the theme of federal disinvestment, there you go. Look at our lack of investment in affordable housing over the last 40, 50 years. And that's why you see tents almost wherever you drive in Portland and really in the Northwest. The same challenges around infrastructure, and increasingly in the Gorge, one of the key economic development priorities is getting more access to broadband internet, which you can get in a very narrow strip, but if you're, 5-10 miles off the river, you're basically out of luck. And so if you're trying to develop a business, you've got a big impediment right there. Again, that's an infrastructure investment that should be, and historically was, underwritten by the federal government, and not so much anymore. You can look at, so I also sit on the Portland School Board. We adopted our budget last night, and one of the big issues we're dealing with is a decline in federal funding for education, for title programs specifically allocated for special education for low-income students and so on. And I'm sure that's being played out in Skamania County as well. So a lot of these issues deal with what's going on with the federal government.
So those are some of the challenges. And now if you could talk a little bit about what you think Skamania's best opportunities for economic development are in light of those challenges.
Do we want to reverse order here?
Sure. So I can go. Well, again, from the port's perspective, we have property in the city of North Bonneville. We have 42 acres. We've already built in the infrastructure. We have millions of dollars invested in the roads, the storm sewer. We have 2 different fiber optic vendors that have pulled the fiber through there. We have all the water, sewer, everything's there. We're not allowed to develop this property because we need a 15-foot easement to connect to a road that is owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we've been working on that easement since 1999. The Army Corps actually gave the property to the city of North Bonneville for economic development purposes, and then over time, the port ended up acquiring it from the city. Over time, the people change, politics change, those kind of things. We're very close to having that easement now, but so it's just taken a while. So
Sounded a lot more like a challenge than an opportunity.
I think some of the other things, we have a lot of light industrial on our waterfront. So, and if you're not familiar with ports are, we're small, or we're local governments, not all small. The Port of Portland, Port of Seattle, those are very large. But we manage land. It's generally considered some of the most valuable land in the area in the public's trust. So in whichever manner the public thinks they need that valuable land to be used at. And those attitudes and things change over time. So we have our light industrial buildings and things right on the waterfront. None of them are waterfront dependent, but we don't have any place to move them to. So, I guess those, again, maybe a challenge, not an opportunity. But it would be, if we could move them to this other business park, then we could redevelop the waterfront in a way that would best serve the community as they see it today. So.
Okay. From the Economic Development Council's perspective, some of the things that we've been working on to address workforce and housing, we recognize that with regards to housing and development of housing, that we have a limited land base. And so we're really trying to analyze efficiency when it comes to affordable housing and housing in general. So going up rather than out, we cannot, I think it's fair to say that we cannot expand our urban boundary based on the National Scenic Area. So we really have a finite resource there. And so we're looking at efficiencies and ways to really take advantage of the existing land base that we have, working with property owners to reiterate the need for affordable workforce housing, having housing on second and third floors and retail on base floors so that we're really maximizing that use. So we've started looking at doing a housing study and buildable lands inventory to really assess what our needs are, what industrial land do we have, when are we going to reach full build out so we can better plan for the future. So we're looking at doing that right now. And then with regards to workforce, we've started to, in the last couple of years, really develop the relationships between the local businesses and the school district. And the school district has a CTE program and have been partnering with the welding industry and the manufacturing industry to really try to analyze what the students need. We have no local colleges in our entire county, so we really are looking at working with the school district to make sure that the students within the school district have that expertise in welding and know mechanics and electrical components, and they learn the basics and maybe even earn certificates. So we're working towards that. We have an apprenticeship and internship program that started this last year that's a regional effort throughout the Gorge, and all the local businesses are being educated on that resource and building an apprenticeship or internship program within their area and within their school districts. So we're working on all of those avenues to really strengthen our workforce and really promote having our students, our young people, stay within the community and be trained and ready to go into the workforce when they graduate.
All right, from the county's perspective, I think one of the things that we've seen happen in the last year and a half is we have a lot more conversations with all of the other groups in the county that impact what happens there. We have more conversations with Pat and Kari. The PUD we have more people at the table. And I think that that's certainly a positive thing, because if you're not communicating with one another, you're going to miss opportunities. And just in the past couple of days on the housing aspect of it, we have some property there in the old Wind River Nursery, and we're trying to find what's the best and highest use for the county. We've been talking about affordable housing in that area, and recently discovered that there are some pretty good funding options out there. So we're beginning to explore that. And the other one is, and I've only been there about 12 years, so I'm a very newcomer to the population. But I've spent a lot of time looking at the forest in the Forest Service and looking at the history of it. And I think one of the things that from the commissioner's perspective is that we have this incredible resource there that can play to recreation, environmental compliance, but also produces incredible amounts of timber. The Forest Service says that it adds about 500 million board feet a year. And if you look at the production off of the forest, it used to be about 343 million board feet a year. We had probably 1,200 employees. Today, the average is about 23 million board feet. And some of that goes into stewardship sales, which we don't get the 25% of. So we're working actively with the legislatures to see if we can't improve that, because the forest is capable of more than that. And we would like to get away from single species management and manage for broader habitats for a number of different species. And while we will never recover the number of jobs because technology has dramatically changed the logging industry, the number of people that it takes to produce 1 million board feet is probably a fifth of what it was. There's still an incredibly strong market right now. The folks in the business said this is the strongest timber market in their lifetime. And so, there's a lot of timber coming off private land. But the fact that we made the agreement back in 1908, that we would give up the tax base and take 25% of the timber harvest. And that worked very well until about 1992. So we're working on that because we feel that that's a reasonable resource that could be developed to a stronger level than it is at now.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate what Tom was saying about timber, that there's been a huge decline in timber harvest. And again, that affects the county's tax base because the county used to get a piece of the sales revenue from those sales. And so that's why the SRS program started, was in lieu of, we're greatly reducing the timber output from the national park. That affects county budgets, and so we'll throw some money at you, and now not so much money at you, and there you go. And I think Tom was suggesting there's probably room to increase the harvest on national forest lands with, I believe it's well under the allowable cut that was part of the timber harvest deals when the plans were put in place in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I think the gorge differs from some other areas. If you go to, I think it's the Ochako Forest in Central Oregon, environmentalists and the industry sat down and worked out their differences. And that's been an ongoing cooperative effort. And so it took all the lawsuits out of, suggested timber harvesting, and has been of great benefit to that community in terms of the mills there know that they have a steady local supply. That's helped their profitability and helped keep employment up there. It would be great if something like that could happen in the gorge as well. We're not there yet. And also, a second thing is, I see Skamania County, technically they're part of the Portland metro area, and that's because when the Skamania Coply last plywood mill left in almost in the Northwest closed in 1992, and without a local college. A lot of those workers drove to Vancouver to Clark College to get job training, and that's when the light bulb came on and said, it's not a great commute, but it's not a terrible commute, and commuting patterns changed. So the determination of the metro area is that there are enough Skamania County residents commuting into the metro area. That's one of the definitions of in or out for a rural county. There's also a fair amount of cross-county commuting into gorge counties, Wasco County, Hood River County, Klickitat County, that there's really a gorge labor market area. So Skamania is kind of 1 foot in each camp. And there's some pretty good economic development cooperation going on in the gorge, and that's important going forward. Again, all those counties are affected revenue-wise, and making the most of what you have is an opportunity that I think local folks are taking advantage of.
So let's spend a little bit of time talking about federal funding. Secure rural schools payments have declined since they first started, and last year Congress didn't renew SRS at all. Where have you seen the impacts of unstable federal funding? That might be a good one to start with, Tom.
All right. And I sort of addressed that in my previous comments when we had this decline, pardon me, and started to have to shed people back about 2010 that continued through 2013, which is when things got stabilized. We had the loan paid off, SRS had returned, and we were down to pretty much a minimal workforce. And so one of the things that we're focusing on as a result of that is learning to do more with less. We think that technology is the key to making that work and be successful. So, pardon me, the reduction in that also impacted the services to the citizens. We had a really interesting ice storm followed by a snowstorm the past couple of Januaries. And I know that my wife and I sat in our house for 8 days without power or phone. And when I got to the office, the phone started ringing. People, I've lived here 35 years and I've never had to wait 3 weeks to have my road plowed. What's wrong with you people? I'd been in the job about 3 weeks. It was like, whoops. Talk to the people who know, and it said, well, your answer should be, remember, in 2008, you had $6 million in SRS funding. We had 47 guys on the road crew. Today you have 12, and no SRS. So, those are the types of impacts that we're seeing.
So what we see is kind of the classic trickle-down effect from the lack of funding for SRS through the county. The county is a significant partner in most economic development efforts in Skamania County, and when they don't have funding for that, we see that trickle down, not only directly impacting our organization, but we also see that in affecting the layoffs of workers at the county level. There's a huge impact to the school system. And what that leads to, in my opinion, is there's this overall social impact of people just feeling like that they're left to their own devices without any resources to improve their situation. And it sounds kind of gloom and doom, and I don't want it to seem that way, because we have a lot of resourceful people and a lot of really smart and intelligent business owners and community members, but when you have a significant partner that's been disabled essentially because of a lack of funding, it makes it really difficult to move forward. You continually get a little bit behind every year, and to catch up, it's significant, and it takes a long time, a lot longer to catch up and become whole again than you think. And with infrastructure costs increasing, Pat will get a little bit more into that, but with infrastructure costs increasing and increasing costs, with aging buildings, especially with the school district and other buildings within the counties or within the county, it really is damaging in the long run as you get further and further behind with funding.
Well, the port doesn't receive any direct federal funding or anything from SRS, but what we see is similar to what Kari said is, we all have small governments. Tom just gave a great statistic. We're 25% of the entire metro area from Skamania County all the way to Hillsborough. In land base, they have a road crew of 12. I mean, it's in hundreds of miles of roads to maintain it. The reality is hard for people, I'm sure, in Portland to really understand. But our governments have to work very closely together in order for us all to survive. So when any one of those government partners are struggling to meet their very basic services, we all suffer. So that's really the major impact that as far as the port sees.
So the question is, where have you seen the impacts of unstable federal funding? And my answer would be, where haven't you seen it? Housing, education, healthcare, workforce training, food stamps, infrastructure. Many of you, if you've been to the Gorge, you've driven over the Hood River Bridge across the Columbia. That needs to be replaced. And there's no way that local funding can do that, no way. And if we don't have infrastructure funding federally to do that, I don't know what's going to happen, but in a relatively short period, that bridge will be inoperable, and that will be a huge blow to the Gorge economy. And that's just one example. Pat's given other examples. You know, I'm sure you guys all have examples of that.
And so what do you think the role of the federal government should be in the county and why?
Me go first? I'll happily go first. Well, you know, like I said, I don't want this to be gloom and doom, and I want to really point out that before I talk about what I think their role should be, we have really, really incredible federal and state representatives that we work with on a daily basis that support us, and especially Representative Herrera Butler's office and her staff, as well as Senator Murray and Cantwell, and all of our state reps, Curtis King, Norm Johnson, and Gina McCabe. They all are very supportive of our community and are helpful where they can be with regards to putting pressure on regulatory agencies in order to push funding into our county. And I expect the federal government to be like any other business partner that I work with. I hold them to the same standard. So I expect them to be at the table with us, and I expect them to be interested and engaged in our community. And to date, we have a seat on our EDC board that remains unfilled by the Forest Service because we can't get anyone to come to the table. And so that's really frustrating, considering 80% of our land base is forest land, and it's a huge component of our economic development, and we can't get them to sit at the table with us. And so, and I recognize that they have funding issues too, but we all make an effort to get to the table, so we expect the same from them. We also have some scenic area funding, economic development scenic area funding that was appropriated back in 1986, and to date we're still waiting for that remaining $1.9 million, which if you think about it, from 1986 forward, if we would have had that money to invest in the community through our large loan programs for our small businesses, think of all the return on that over the last 30 plus years, 40 plus years. So it's really crucial to get that remaining funding and to recognize how impactful the lack of that funding over the last several years has been, and how that trickles and expands over time.
I can go next. So Kari and I carpooled in and we talked about these things. So our answers, she stole my answer. No, anyway.
Sorry.
That's all right. So we have similar. But, you know, again, if I want to kind of give some details and maybe some examples, you know, the federal government owns the majority of our county. So they, right off the bat, you know, they control the land, the resources, those kind of things. That makes them a player, that makes them, you know, gives them some responsibility as a community member. I gave you the example of trying to get this 15-foot easement to connect to an Army Corps federal road, and the difficulties there. We will get it before 20 years is up, I'm sure. But you know, those kind of things are really frustrating. And there's a lot of underutilized land. There's land that they hold and that they don't need and isn't being used. Another example would be, we own a bunch of industrial buildings in North Bonneville. It's on the north side of Highway 14. It's away from everything. And the Army Corps owns several acres of land with derelict buildings on them that hasn't been used in decades. And you know, we've asked for it. You know, can we buy it? Can you surplus it or some way? But it's just hard with a very large agency to get that through. And like Kari said, you know, our federal and state representatives are awesome, but they don't run these agencies. They can put political pressure on them. They can call. In order for, when I started at the port, the easement thing had kind of fallen on the wayside. I couldn't find anybody in the Army Corps to pick up the phone and actually talk to me about the easement. So we had to get our senators involved, and then they called me and said, all right, you're going to deal with this person in the real estate department. But for weeks I called and I kept getting the phone run around that, nope, wrong person, here, try this guy. So those kind of things. So this would be my example.
All right. And again, I look north, so to speak, from where the population is. at the forest. All right, it's again an incredible resource, and for a multitude of reasons, the Forest Service seems to become more and more dysfunctional. And so we've worked with a group of people, and there are a couple of representatives from that group here. They call themselves the Gifford Pinchot Accountability Group. Forest Service didn't like accountability, but they were trying to hold them to task. And one of the things that they came up with was, I think, a positive solution that we're trying to get to the table, and they call it the 100 million board feet plan. So I have another stick. And, pardon me, this one represents the entire forest. So you're looking at about 1,300,000 acres. And if you look at what's in the monument area and wilderness areas, that's about 500,000 acres. This virtually very little goes in. You know, recreation is a big part of it because you've got the Mount St. Helens Observatory. Middle section here is about 350,000 acres. They call that LSR, Late Successional Reserve, and it's primarily for the management of the northern spotted owl. And then there are the old plantations, all right? These are timber management lands, matrix, and administratively managed lands. About 500,000 acres of that. So the fellows came forth and said, you know, if you looked at this in terms of a timber cycle, the time it takes from when you do a harvest or a thinning to where you've got trees of similar size in the forest, it's about a 50-year cycle. So their thought was, if we take 2% of those 10,000 acres a year, and you manage them on a cycle, you're never going to manage the full 10,000 acres, but what you would get out of that 10,000 acres would probably be about 100 million board feet. That's money that goes back to the Forest Service, you know, to be able to work on recreation. We just had a meeting in town, and they're saying, we haven't got any money to take care of the trails, the roads. Our deferred maintenance is $210 million on the Gifford Pinchot, the greatest of any of the forests. So that would help them, and it would be a huge help to the county in terms of the 25% timber receipt portion for us. So you would just cycle through that. So we thought that that was a fairly positive thing, and it was reasonable, because we're always looking for three things. It's got to be reasonable, it's got to be sustainable, and it's got to be predictable. All right? So those are the three things that we think apply to the forest and apply to the county. So I think that's a positive aspect from where we sit.
So I'm not going to talk about what should the federal government do as a state employee. I'm going to mention some things that they could do that others have brought about as potential ideas. And one we haven't talked very much about healthcare, but we know in the United States we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as Europe does, with worse results. And imagine having and Europe is full of different, and Canada, you know, there's all sorts of different ways to do it. Pick one, I don't care. We would free up a huge amount of money in our economy to be invested elsewhere, or to be returned in lower taxes. Take your pick. It's all good. But that affects the local level, because there are people who are not, cannot afford to get health insurance, and it's that we're not poor enough to qualify, and what's available is, you know, you can get it'll only cover a disaster, and it costs you a huge amount of money per month, and there are people caught in that. Education and training, low-income housing, a job guarantee program is actually starting to be, there's kind of a bipartisan actually debate on some kind of job guarantee program. That's different from a basic income program, which just says we're going to give everybody enough money to survive. A job guarantee program has lots more I think, positive potential going forward. And finally, financial regulation. We know rural counties, you go, you put your money in the bank. It's usually, or all too often, a Wells Fargo, Chase, whoever, big money center bank. That money doesn't stay in the community. That money leaves and goes out into the global financial markets, and relatively small portions stay for loans for either consumers or businesses. Some financial regulation that said, no, if it's deposited here, this much has to stay here, would make a difference, I think, for local businesses.
So I want to touch on something that Scott mentioned earlier, which is Skamania's role in the Gorge. Can you talk about the unfulfilled opportunities for cross-border regional collaboration in the Columbia Gorge?
I can start. One of the boards that I sit on is the Regional Transportation Council for Southwest Washington. Excuse me. One of the things that I see is being able to move people around. And I find it interesting because until we started working with Yvonne and the group, I didn't think that much about the metropolitan area, but suddenly I find that somebody's put us into it. And when I look at the Gorge, I think, the other counties, you've got Klickitat, Hood River, Wasco, we have a lot more in common with them, I think, than we do with, this, very intense urban area. And so when you look at it, it's transportation every morning, I think, and Scott's going to have to verify this for me, but we have about 5,800 to 6,000 jobs or so in the county, and every morning, about 65 to 70% of those folks wake up and leave the county to go to work. And when they leave, they take their paycheck with them, right? Because we have such a limited retail center or commercial centers in the county. If you leave the county and you come to Vancouver or you come to Portland, you stop at Fred Meyer's, you buy gas there, you go to Costco, and so that sales tax, leaves the county. And then we have this differentiation between income tax and sales tax that I won't get into. But I look at the ability of people to move around in the Gorge, and it's very difficult. The Dog Mountain situation, if you ever hike that trail, we run a shuttle out there, and I'm thinking, would it be great for someone to be able to get on a bus and either come to town or go to Hood River White Salmon? I think the ODOT folks have got a bus running now for the summer every 2 hours or so on the Oregon side. So I'm trying to promote that on the north side of the river. And again, it all comes down to money. But again, there's so many things that we do have in common. And there are differences. I mean, you look at Hood River County in terms of the ag there and the tourism. I look at Skamania County. I mean, it's an incredible place to live. It's a hard place to make a living. And Mother Nature was not particularly generous with flat land. So when you look at the land that we have to develop, most of it is trying to get from the mountain to be a valley somewhere. And so, that's a restriction. But again, I see a commonality there. There are an awful lot of groups working on trying to be more cohesive. And I find that very rewarding. And it's a goal that we should all strive to work for, because there's a lot there that we could all benefit from.
Well, and Tom, was talking about transportation. Obviously, we have a bus in Skamania County that goes to Vancouver because that's where the majority, a lot of our workforce. I used to ride that bus. Actually, Paul Spencer in the back. We used to ride the bus. But then it goes in the summer as far as Dog Mountain. The Klickitat County bus doesn't get as far, so it doesn't connect. We don't have any health care services. We have one clinic in Stevenson, but we don't have a hospital, any sort of emergency thing. So if somebody doesn't have a vehicle, there's no way for them to get to the hospital, those kind of things. Within the Gorge, the ports themselves, we actually work very closely together. We meet on a regular basis. One of my tenants was not considering, actually they're our largest tenant, they were not considering Stevenson or Skamania County at all. They wanted to move into the Dalles. Well, the Dalles didn't have the building size and stuff that they needed. It just so happened that we had a large tenant in situ that had moved out when they built a campus of their own. And so they referred them to us, and we are the beneficiary of that very generous kind of thinking. Kari will get into workforce. She's on a workforce thing, but each state has their own rules. Each county has its own rules, its own funding, and it's very hard to intermix those. I think education is another one. We have we're spread out. The schools are spread out, but the football teams don't play each other. Those simple things. Basketball. Even though we can see across and we can see where there's another school, they don't actually intermix. And education is certainly another area that could be improved. Those kind of things.
So you should feel better now because you stole some of my responses. So now we're even.
I left you workforce.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. I have 4 things listed under this question as, and I don't know if unfulfilled is the right word, but it's things that we're working towards to take better advantage of. Transportation, disaster, emergency services, and education are all, those 4 things are all opportunities for cross-border collaboration that we are starting to work on that will take a long time. And most of that is because it relates to state and federal agencies. We have transportation issues, and we have limited in and out in the Gorge, and we have 2 private sector bridges. We have ports that control both of those, and so it's a little bit different in trying to go about and get funding and to determine what funding they're eligible for because they're private. Owned by ports, and so that makes it challenging to get funding for those bridges, or more challenging anyways. And with regards to transportation, we also have some issues with heavy use on our Highway 14. It damages the road, makes it harder to maintain because we have a lot of truck traffic that crosses at Bridge of the Gods. They fill up in Oregon, they cross at Bridge of the Gods, and then they use our Scenic Highway to get all of their goods to central Washington or wherever they're going. And it's to avoid the taxes because there's a different taxing system in each state. So they figured out a way to do that, and which, kudos to them, I guess. But, it's really challenging because the states have different taxing systems, and they haven't at this point been able to be willing to negotiate how to correct that so we don't have this overuse on one side versus the other. So that's a transportation issue that we've been dealing with. Disaster funding. We had the extreme Eagle Creek fire last year. We had the winter storm of 2016, which was the most horrible that I've seen, and I've been there since the mid-90s. And we weren't eligible for disaster funding because we couldn't include damages that were on the Oregon side in the Gorge, and because it's a different state, right? So there's just those things that seem small, but are very hugely impactful when it comes to funding. Emergency services has taken a long time to be able to get an ambulance on the Washington side over to Cascade Locks or anywhere else on the Oregon side because they're not funded to provide services in Oregon. So, and we really, in reality, we are this tight-knit region, and we can't rely on Vancouver or Portland to get out into the Gorge to help. We've got to rely on each other cross river, and there's boundaries and borders with that state collaboration that have been challenging. And education as well. And we're working towards correcting all these, but it does take a lot of time, and so that's why I'm bringing them up. The last one is education. We have a lot more students now that are going and finishing their high school education at local colleges. Every time a student leaves a high school and goes across to Oregon, that high school district loses that funding for that student. So it makes it really challenging for high schools to work together with the local colleges and partner, which they should be doing, to really give a better education to their students when they risk losing all their funding. So that's a challenge that we've been starting to work on and have conversations with cross-border as well. The nearest college in the Gorge is the Columbia Gorge Community College. It has a Hood River branch. But again, you send students there, you're losing your funding for your school district because it's per student. So it's something that we need to work on.
So you're talking about high school,
Yes.
students still in high
Yep.
school who enroll in community college
Yep.
courses, as opposed to graduating.
Yes.
Actually, well, Scott's thinking, she mentioned the bridges, so we have 2 bridges in the gorge, actually 3, there's one in that goes between Dallas and Dallasport. But they're over 20 miles spread apart. And the ports on the Oregon side own the bridges, and they charge a toll. So they're charging tolls for people that are gonna come to they either live, work, or visiting our county. But it's money that's staying on the Oregon side, and none of that really trickles over. So as far as our workforce, a majority of our workforce commutes outside the county. They're paying to actually access the freeway system, and that's money that's being removed from our area and going to another area. So as an opportunity for collaboration, they could do some revenue sharing.
Yeah, the boundaries are just crazy stuff, and the different regulation and tax regimes just are crazy. So you go over to Oregon to shop, and there's no sales tax, and so Oregon doesn't benefit from that, and Skamania and the Washington side lose revenue, and that's certainly true for Clark County as well. That there's a huge outflow of retail spending into the Portland side that doesn't get taxed. And if you work in Oregon, and as an Oregon resident, thank you very much for your income tax payments. They're gonna kill me. Yeah, right, there we go. And around, the other piece of it is we divide states up into workforce development areas, and Skamania and Klickitat are attached to Yakima and Kittitas counties, which are much bigger. And so it's kind of the tail end of where does workforce investment, and it's not a ton of money, but where does workforce investment take place in their region, kind of ignored. And really, and I tried to push for this when we were taking a look at those boundaries to say, let's do a bi-state area of the 5 counties in the Gorge, because that's the labor shed. That would make perfect sense for training needs. And a small victory was we publish occupational wage surveys, which are really important to employers. What's the labor market now for, what's the median wage for an office clerk, or, a couple of hundred other occupations. And for a long time, Klickitat and Skamania were lumped in with Yakima, and it just totally gets washed out. But now my department now publishes a 5-county occupational wage survey. So there's actually some Gorge specific labor market information. But that's the kind of thing, that's a small piece, but that's the kind of thing that should happen all the way up through the workforce development system. There is through MCED, the Mid-Columbia Economic Development District is essentially by state, and there's a lot of cooperation through there, through loan programs and so on. And that's a pretty important feature in the Gorge. But there just needs to be more of that gets beyond this boundary craziness.
So right now, the majority of county residents work outside the county. Is that a trend that you see changing anytime soon?
I am going to defer to Scott on that because I think I stepped on his toes in my last comment, and I think we should let you run with that one.
I don't know what you did, but I'll accept your apology. I'm so oblivious. No, that's the simple answer. I don't see that changing anytime soon. And that jobs housing imbalance, it's been a huge topic in Clark County for years and years, because residential property doesn't pay for itself in terms of the services needed for residents. commercial industrial property is what you need in balance. And if you don't have that balance, and again, in Skamania County, losing that revenue source from timber, you're double whammied. So feel free to pile on.
Well, Scott and I think crossed paths about 6 or 7 years ago at the EDC conference, he's been incredibly helpful with data. And so I had really never thought about how many people moved out of the county every morning to go to work. And so if you think about that number, 6,000 jobs, I think we've got somewhere between maybe 2,200 and 2,400 jobs in the county. Well, a lot of those jobs are held by people outside the county. So they come into the county to work, but they can't buy a pair of shoes, and why, you're going to get gas at one of the big stations where you live. And so one of the things that we did was we asked Scott for some data from the federal databases. And one of them was the average wage for the weekly wage in Skamania County. It seemed to me it was like between $650 and $700. You go over to Klickitat County, it jumps up to something around 880, and it climbs to a state average of something like 1,300 a week. So again, there isn't a huge amount that is in the county to be spent. And then we looked at what happens with sales tax. Obviously there's some drain to this side, but those things that are taxed produce revenues for the various county agencies. And it was surprising to me. We just took all of the federal data that said, this is the money that moves in Skamania County that is taxed. So we thought of that as that's cash churn. And the more money you've got churning around, the better off you are. Because every time it changes hands, it gets taxed. All right? And so for that, the average spend per capita in Skamania County, I think was $9,400. If you went to Klickitat County, it was about $12,004. If you go to Clark, it's $13,700. The average for the state of Washington is $19,500. So we're less than half of the sales tax generation capacity of that. And again, it pretty much comes back to with 7,800 acres is where our urban areas are that we can develop in. And so when you say more development, well, that's what's already developed, right? So that's a challenge there. So that folks moving outside of the county have an incredible impact on, the financial stability of the county.
So I feel like I was a student that was looking on someone else's paper. I was looking at Scott's response. What I thought was his response, do you see this trend continuing? And he had no written down, and I was like, what does he know that I don't know? I agree with...
Did I answer it wrong?
No, it's fine. I do see the trend continuing.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I just thought you had some secret that I didn't know about.
Well, I'm waiting for your announcement of the joint Amazon, Microsoft, Google project.
We can't talk about that yet.
Oh, sorry. The cloud settles over Skamania County, and all this money drops down.
That would be wonderful.
Sorry, my answer should have been yes. I see this trend continuing in terms of commuting.
So I think we're all in agreement that the trend will continue. It's really just it's the idea of it being a shorter distance. It's a commutable distance, and it's always gonna be there. I did it for 6 years, so I think we all recognize that it's a reasonable commute. Although this summer I don't know if it will be with ODOT's announcements on all of their work that they're going to be doing on all of the major highways. But what does this mean for finances, culture, and future? I think the challenge is controlling leakage. Tom alluded to that, and it's making sure we have the right businesses and industries within our county that will make people think twice about going outside the county as their way, commuting to work, grabbing a cup of coffee before they leave Skamania County, filling up on gas before they leave, grabbing a breakfast before they leave, or whatnot. So it's really a matter of strategy and trying to control that leakage. One of the challenges that I see that's, I think, hugely impactful, and I mentioned the social impact up before in one of my answers, is that you have a segment of the population that's disconnected. I don't know how many people that we talk to on a daily basis. They're like, we had no idea that you were doing a pub talk last night out at Elk Ridge Golf Course, and it's because they have a job in the Portland metro area or in Vancouver. And by the time they leave in the morning at 7 a.m. and they come home at 7 at night, they're exhausted. And all they want to do, and I don't blame them, is curl up in their chair and read a book or watch some TV and grab some dinner. And so we have a lot of people, statistics, percentage I'm not quite sure on, that do that. And I think it allows for that disconnection where you're not really engaged with the community and with the school and with the sports programs and with everything that's offered in the community, which I think we have a lot. And so you just have that disconnection, and it's a challenge to bring that portion of the population into the community and really engage with them. I see that challenge continuing, but I don't see it as something that we can't overcome, especially with new ways of communication and ways to get into and communicate with them, even if they're not in the county a lot of the time.
So just some stats. Last year, there was an average of 4,800 Skamania County residents with a job, and in the county, there was an average of 2,170 jobs. So you see the differential right there, and that's the net. And if you look at the gross underlying that, there's even more Skamania County residents working outside the county, because there are folks who live outside of the county who work in Skamania. And that's the biggest differential of any county in the state in terms of that cross-county community. And it has all those impacts, the social impacts, as well as the economic impacts. But I was at Aniche picking up my wine order this. There's an incredible a growing number of vineyards in Skamania County, and I joined a wine club. And let me tell you, went to pick up our order on Saturday. We're on this slope overlooking, Mount Hood, view of the Columbia. Doesn't get much, and my wife's going, how can we move here?
You're not alone.
Yeah.
I think we're all members. Anyway,
I meant, that too.
yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add.
I met her at the EDC.
Yeah.
So again, when we're looking at recruiting businesses, or what businesses are actually going to be sustainable within the port's commercial properties that we own, they're industries that are going to produce and then export whatever it is that they produce outside of our county. There's nothing really churning along within our county. So I think, and again, the word leakage keeps getting used, but it really is a term. And obviously, the stats that Scott gave is a pretty telling sign. The other thing that we are seeing too is we're getting more retirees moving to our area just because it's a beautiful area, and we're seeing more homes being used for, I don't know what you would call it, short-term rentals. So, which is taking away some of our housing stock for workers. Again, so both those trends, and those aren't specific just to our region, but but they do have an impact.
So I just have one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience. What do you think Skamania County will look like demographically and economically in 10 years?
I can start. I mean, if we look at the city of Stevenson and where it's moved in the last 10 years, really it hasn't moved. I think we'll see the same moderate, and Scott will end with Scott because he'll have the real insights. But we see, we don't have a lot of room to grow. We don't have a lot of capital, we don't have things, the resources that we need to make any big movements, which is fine as part of the appeal to our area. But at the same time, I don't see that there'll be a lot of change. I think, again, if I'll use the city of Stevenson as the example, as our county seat, within the city, there's been one new commercial building built in more than a decade. So, and that's a bank, anyway.
Yeah, so I see the changes. Again, I'll defer to Scott on the demographics, but slightly older population, a slightly wider gap between people with lower incomes and the affluent. And I think Pat mentioned, the second homes and vacation homes are going to continue to increase. We've seen that. It would be great to get a stat on that. I don't know if that's measured or not, but that would be interesting to find out how much that's changed over the last 4 or 5 years, and maybe measure that over the next 5 to 10. We're seeing a pretty big increase in that demand, and so the city and then I believe the county are starting to look at changing their zoning ordinances to manage that a little bit better. But yeah, like Pat said, there's such a small population and there's such a small amount of developable land available that mostly we're going to see small changes over time. And it's never going to be anything huge, which I think is fine based on who we are and what we are. And I think that our diversification of the economy is going to just be an evolution. There's not going to be huge changes, but there will be little businesses that go out and other ones that come in based on the economy and the demand for the time. And I think that's a good thing. And we will continue to support all of our businesses and help them grow in whatever way that we can.
All right. Again, probably slow change, but one of the things that I'm already seeing is the stratification that we have. We have a lot of people wanting to come to Skamania County. A great number of them are retired and can afford the property values there. And one of my concerns is when they arrive, they don't get engaged in the community, all right? We have a lot of people who afford $40 bottles of wine. They hang out with people who buy $40 bottles of wine, and they don't get involved in the Eagles or other things that when people come to the county that surprise me is, what do you mean it's an all-volunteer fire department? It's like, did you see any hydrants around when you were looking at the property? And so, a lot of people come with a level of expectation in terms of the services even, and they're not quite there. And also, I want to talk to our assessor, because I'm curious over the last 5 years what the average appraisal value is for new construction, because I'm betting it's all on the high-end side of things. So, and again, these problems are not specific to Skamania County, but one of the things that makes it more difficult is just the size and, the capacity that we have to deal with this relative to larger urban areas. So I think the trend is going to be relatively slow. I think we as a community need to do more to engage those people that do come here and are not familiar with what they've landed in. Absolutely, my wife and I have lived lots of different places. Thank you for your patience. And this is about as good as it gets in terms of scenic beauty, and I think the spirit of the community is huge.
So I want to share some official population projection data that the state puts out. By 2030, the projection is for Skamania County to have 1,300 more residents, which is about 11% increase. Says less than 1% a year growth, which is roughly what the national rate is. In terms of age, they're predicting the same number of young people under the age of 20, like no change in total. but they're predicting a 650 more adults in the 20 to 39 age group. And I'm trying to figure out, which is a 28% increase, pretty hefty. I'm trying to figure out how you have that many more adults in the childbearing age with no change in the number of kids. So sometimes these models that do the projections kind of at the small counties, you kind of scratching your head a little bit. Substantial decline in the 40 to 59 age group. That's the baby boomers aging out of that. So you're seeing that sort of demographic dip there. And 1,250 more age 60 and over, including 470 aged 80 and over. Now again, that's somewhat of a mechanical process because it raises questions right away of, well, what kind of care facilities are there? What kind of medical facilities are there? And the answer right now is not a whole heck of a lot. So will you actually get folks in that age group sticking around, or when you retire, theoretically, I don't know what retirement means. I've got all these retired friends. You go to somewhere either where it's sunny or where you can fish. But then when you get older than that, you're going to an urban area where you can get medical care. So I don't know how much those numbers actually make sense for the county. And really when you get to that 60 and older, you get an increasing number who shift out of owner-occupied homes into some kind of rental or an assisted care facility. So that's something to think about how that plays out. But it does suggest that there will be an increasing demand regardless for services for folks like me now. I'm 64. Getting all those Medicare things in the mail. I think there will be increasing racial diversity, and that's throughout the Gorge. So right now, Skamania County overall is about 10% residents of color. And but if you look at the under 20 age group, it's about twice that. And that's, you look at Hood River, there's and their student demographics, huge bubbling up of Latino kids. And I don't think they've done a good job of thinking through of how do we integrate this this cultural diversity. You know, that's our future workforce. How do we really make that connection? But I think that will happen in Skamania County and in the Gorge. I think tourism demand is going to go up, and if you think you only need one shuttle now for Dog Mountain, wait 10 years, because increasing population is going to drive increasing demand for, let's go out to the Gorge for a hike. The tax base will be even more of an issue, because you'll see increasing demands and relatively less funding available. I do think there's potential for more niche manufacturing. And if you remember the map of Gifford, Pinchot, and that sort of white cutout area in the middle of the county, that's where the nursery is, I believe. And that's where there's some potential for manufacturing development there, and some potential, again, if you get the easement, you know, all those infrastructure pieces worked out, there's potential in Stevenson, along North Bonneville, and along the river. And certainly there's potential if timber harvest is increased, again, keeping it at that sustainable level, because the Gorge is a beautiful place. Let's not screw that up, as everybody here has said.
So on that note, I think I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. My name's Ann Berblinger. I'm on the board of the Institute for Portland Metropolitan Studies. I'm a humble person of the soil right now. I've been a farmer this is our 19th season, but before that, I was an economic development practitioner. I worked for the Economic Development Administration. And I'm going to just say something first, and then I have a question. What I'm going to say is it could be better, and we know it could be better because it has been better. There were two initiatives that I worked on during my long federal career that really, really made a difference for rural areas. One was started under the senior Bush, George H.W. Bush. It was called the Rural Development Initiative, and it was based on statewide rural development councils, and two of the first ones were in Oregon. I was part of that, and in Washington, and we worked closely with Washington. Problems like your problem with the Corps of Engineers, I think would have been a whole lot easier to deal with a statewide rural development council where people were at the table with the charge of making the federal and the state government work more effectively with rural communities. I don't know quite what it would take to get that kind of thing going again. I wouldn't count on the federal government to take the lead at the current time, but certainly the state of Washington. And everybody who was involved in that is old like me and did retire. Some of us failed at retirement, but the second one was the Pacific Northwest Economic Development Initiative, which was part of the Clinton administration, and it carried on the same themes of really making the government work together on behalf of rural communities, and that one in particularly in relationship to reduced timber harvest. So the sewers, you mentioned the sewer system in Stevenson, is that right? Yeah, the sewer system in Cascade Locks was fixed as a result of that program. They gave that community a lot of capacity. The question I have is for Commissioner Tom. Do you still get payments in lieu of taxes from the Forest Service?
We do.
And would you like to give us an estimate? Payments in lieu of taxes is the federal Forest Service or federal government's way of sort of helping with a token property tax. What percentage of the property tax you would get based on the actual value of that land do you get?
Well, Tom's looking for that. I just want to say many years ago, when I worked at the Oregon Economic Development Department, Ann probably doesn't remember, I had the opportunity to work with her on a couple of grants where we did economic development plans for Umatilla and for Astoria, and she was an incredible partner, so thank you for that.
All right, and thank you for your question. I just happen to have a graph here. I used to be a teacher a long time ago. Anyway, if you look at, this is our revenue income budget. So if you look at this little segment up here, this is federal lands, SRS, timber, and PILT. So we do get several streams of PILT.
Section there?
That's the section here.
Yeah.
24% of the budget. I call this squishy money because you never can be sure that it's coming, but it still is 24% of the budget. So what we get is, in good times, you have SRS comes through, and I think the last payment, it was just reauthorized, so we got about 1.5 million for the county and for the schools. And there's a distinction with Skamania County. We are the only county out of more than 1,000 counties that get SRS. We're the only ones that can use it for the commissioner's current expense budget. The other counties have to use it for roads. It was very specific, all right? The loss of timber from Mount St. Helens is what promulgated that. Somebody in the legislature in DC put a bill in that said you lost 11 billion board feet. So as a result, you people can use the funds for that. So now we drop down to standard PILT. We get about $300,000 a year in that pretty consistently. If you don't get SRS for a year, that formula is reworked and you probably get double to maybe 2.5 times what your standard PILT was. So that's $300,000 So in 2016, we didn't get SRS. So that amount got bumped, and it turned out to be somewhere, I don't have a solid figure, but 800,000 more, all right? But not the same as the 1.3 to 1.5 million in SRS. We get PILT from the state for lands that they have acquired. The Housing Authority has a retirement center in town that they don't pay tax on, and we get $315 a year PILT from that. So there's a hodgepodge of revenue streams that make that up. Is that?
But compared to the value of the land, it's
Yeah,
it's 80% of the land, obviously not as
Right.
valuable as private
Right.
land in the communities, but still, and you get 24%
right.
of your revenue from that.
Right. And the other thing that we struggle with is within the scenic area, the Forest Service continues to acquire land and take it off the tax rolls. We get PILT for that for a period of 7 years, but then it's gone. We've done an assessment on that, and we lose currently about $700,000 a year in property tax within the scenic area as a result of property coming off the tax rolls. And when your property tax total generation is about 12 million, that's a fairly substantial amount of money. So,
Would it be of value to you to have objective assessment of what the value of that Forest Service and Gorge land is?
oh, I think absolutely.
You have one, Tom.
That-
You have an estimate from Gabe.
Right. Well, and again, when we have the assessors look at it, are you looking at a commercial value? A fair
forest
market?
land value,
Okay,
right?
forest land, yeah.
Compared to private
Yeah.
forest land.
And again, that's something that we'll go back and explore, and we can get back to you if that were the case.
And if you actually value that land based on, quote, environmental services in terms of what it does for the our environment, I bet it would be even higher than timberland in
Yeah.
a lot of ways.
Yeah, excellent point.
So, and kind of something else on part of the comment, you know, anything, due to our size, anything that's negative is magnified. It's just the economy of scale, and you mentioned the sewer plant. So in the city of Stevenson, and obviously we all want to be self-sufficient, we don't, you know, we don't want to be sitting up here saying we need handouts, but we're also held to the same standard as an urban area. So we have in the city of Stevenson about 400 sewer connections, and the state is requiring, at this point, the plan is $16 million for the plant and upgrades that are required for the 400 sewer connections. So when you do that math, and it's also going to double the cost, the operating cost, to $850,000 a year. So again, you know, that's over $200 a month just to cover the operating cost per sewer connection. And you know, how do you get around that? You know, you have to get money from the outside to be able to reduce those in a certain way.
And if I can weigh in on that further, I think there's a story sitting in the back of the room with an ex-city manager for Stevenson, where I believe, and help me, Mary Ann, with this, is that when the Clean Waters Act came through, they required you know, Stevenson to meet those standards. And Portland wasn't required to meet those standards for how many years?
It was just last year where you no longer can combine your storm drains with your sewer. That was an Albaugh under 1972.
So, you know, the small community got the thumb put on them, and the big ones got the pass. So,
I have a question.
do we have one here?
Thanks, Mike. I think I've got a loud enough voice. The impact of the recreational use of the scenic area, be it Gifford, Pinchot, or the Gorge scenic area, has had an impact that we haven't explored. Could you do that, a little bit of that in terms of fire, the volunteer fire departments, emergency services people?
Search and rescue.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was another part to the question about SRS. When you get SRS, there's a 15% amount that is divvied up between what they call Title II and Title III funds. Title II funds have to go back to projects that benefit the forest. Title III funds can be used by the county for search and rescue, sheriff's patrols on the forest, those types of things, but they're very specific, right? They basically benefit the forest. So when you don't get that, all of a sudden, our our SAR people, who are all volunteers, all right, are still out there, but the sheriff's expenses are not covered. And I saw a figure the other day that stunned me. We had a couple that wanted to get to a place where they shouldn't have been. She takes a tumble, and we end up having to bring a chopper in from Astoria with the Coast Guard. 4 hours from the time they left, make the recovery and go back. Anybody care to guess what that bill was? It's your tax dollars, it's not the county's, it's federal money. $49,000 for that one incident. We had 4 sheriff's deputies there, we had 12 SAR people there. So, you know, we had accrued costs also that we don't recover, but that's where we're thankful that those Title III funds are there. But again, the increase in travelers and visitors because of the fire, you know, they're discovering places that, you know, they never knew were there. And Google and Twitter and Facebook really help. There's some areas, I think, Tom, Lindy, you were up at Panther Creek Falls the other day, and how many cars were there?
36.
36. I've been there 12 years. We go there a lot. I've never seen more than 6 cars. So, you know, we're being discovered, which is great because we hope everybody, you know, leaves some money on the way in and out. But also, there's exposure for us in terms of capacity. And again, very limited EMS, very limited sheriffs. And if you call EMS and they come make a call and they don't transport you to a medical center, we don't get reimbursed. And a lot of times we make runs to Dog Mountain for sprained ankles. That takes equipment and staff off the table for 3 to 4 hours. And, you know, we bear the brunt of that. So be prepared when you come to the Gorge.
Did you have a question?
Hi, I'm Michael Mills with Oregon Solutions in this building in the Hatfield School of Government, but I spent about 7 years in North Bonneville in Skamania County. The house I built is on the right-hand side of the photograph there. I was a member of the Eagles and the Volunteer Fire Department. But the thing that stuck with me from my years there and my question to these two is the state and federal government have always treated Skamania County like a forgotten child, a little bit of an orphan. It doesn't really belong to Oregon, doesn't really belong to Olympia or the Washington delegation. And we see that in the comments that you made about the Corps of Engineers not being able to get something which is relatively simple done in a 19-year period. So the question is, what kind of strategies or actions can you take to finally get both the state elected officials and your federal delegation to pay more attention to the critical situation that faces Skamania County now?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. I think being more, exposing ourselves more to them and making sure that on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, we're communicating with them very cohesively on the issues that we're facing in the county. The state reps and our federal reps and their staff are acutely aware of the things that are going on in our county and have been very helpful in helping to apply pressure. I don't know what the solution is on the regulatory agencies and the issues that we have. It seems that you can only apply so much pressure to those agencies, and then you just have to sit and wait. And I have not found a solution necessarily yet to answer that question fully, but we will continue to go down the avenues that we already have with our reps, our federal and state reps, and we will make sure to do a better job of having our voices heard at that level. And hopefully over time we'll see some improvements and some changes.
So I think we as local leaders and elected officials and the like bear a lot of responsibility. We need to be in their face. We need to make sure they know we exist. An example would be Workforce Development Council. So Tom had mentioned the Workforce Development Council that covers our county, also covers Klickitat, Yakima, and Kittitas County. So 4 counties, they have a board of 27 people, and they had not had a Skamania County representative in almost a decade. So when I called there, their director didn't even really know where Skamania County was, even though they cover it. He's like, well, we have these representatives. I'm like, well, they're close. They're in Goldendale. They're in another county though. And it literally took a drive to Yakima to walk into the office and say, no, we really need help. We get less than 1% of all their funding actually trickles down to our county, and that's it's just a calculation. They get X amount of funding it's per person, and then we have such a small county. So, and that's just the economy scale of the economics of it. But I really think that in the more that we're in Olympia, the more that we meet with our representatives, and we've said this over and over, our federal and state representatives are really good partners, and and part of our other responsibility is to be cooperative. It's not just go there and whine and hope that they take care of you. They're also trying to get things done, and they need help, and so that's part of our role as well.
And thanks for your question. One of the things that I have preached a long time, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. All right, so we have worked very hard to engage the Forest Service. DNR has been very receptive. But again, it's because we are there at the meetings, we're making comments and engaging them. Our local folks in Olympia are sterling. They do a great job. The problem is they're pretty singular, and you're always looking at the balance between urban and rural. If you look at the country, I think it is 80% of our population lives on 4% of our land. All right, so you are very compressed. It's one of the most highly urbanized countries of all the industrial nations. So, there's a very different feel, and expectations, I think, from folks that live in Skamania County and people that reside in the urban areas. So we need to get the message out, and that's why I'm very appreciative of this opportunity, because it's been a long time since we've actually been able to engage a large number of people, from the urban setting for the most part. So that's good. And again, I think in looking at the history of Skamania County, what happened with the closure of the nursery and the Forest Service, the litigation and whatnot, it's been really contentious between the local community and the Forest Service. And I had somebody come to me the other day who was on a fire team and said, our fire team, when we're finished with one, both of us worked on a fire, they don't go sit down, and have dinner or a beer or whatever you do. Everybody goes back to their point of origin. And they said, this has got to stop, right? We work on things together. We should have a better understanding of what the needs are for both sides. So those are the types of things that have been in the past. I would say that I've been dealing with the Forest Service for about 7 years now, and I think our voice is better, but again, the constraints that they have with the money that they are able to do things with, they can't get to the finish line. So
I think too, it's there's a cultural shift that's going on or has gone on in Skamania County. So, from 1950 to mid-90s, we didn't need a dime. I mean, we did, but we were a very rich county. And then all of a sudden that was gone. And culturally, the community and the people that live in the county weren't used to playing the game. And so it's taken a long time to recognize what's actually needed within our community leaders to play the game and find the funds like everybody else does. And so that's taken quite a long time. And I think too, one of the challenges that we have with the Forest Service, I mentioned that, we have an open seat at our EDC board for Forest Service. We don't, 80% of our county is forest land, and we don't have a headquarters. We don't even have an office with Forest Service staff in our county at all. It's all Vancouver or Trout Lake. So there's no presence in our community with Forest Service, and it makes it really challenging for them and for us to communicate effectively and have them be partners in the community when there's no presence.
We have time for about 2 more questions. If we have 2 more questions.
I don't think I need that. I'm Channel Farm from the City of Greater Portland, Maine, regional organization for Metro. We technically cover Skamania County and MSA, but I was more curious about tourism, and is there any appetite by tourism agencies on both sides of the states, so Oregon and Washington, ever getting together to bring more visibility to the community and understanding that some capacity constraints on services that the county provides? And that's one question. My second question is, lost my name. And I might remember it. Maybe it's not good.
I can just tell you what I know in working with the Chamber of Commerce in Skamania County. I know I believe this year was the first year that the state tourism board was actually funded. I don't know if there's technically even a board, but where there was actually money allocated for a statewide tourism effort. So that's a positive movement forward, but it's been a while, and it's definitely not enough funding. And there has been some cross-state collaboration with tourism. I think it's Columbia River Gorge Visitors Association. It's a regional visitors association that has Oregon and Washington efforts. And I know that there's been some collaboration specifically with Oregon there's been some activities and I see nodding in the back, so if someone else knows some of the terminology or some of the events, but I know there's definitely been efforts in collaboration across the boundaries, and it's really helped kind of have a cohesive message that gets out to everybody about the gorge.
The pardon me here, throat. One of the things that I've seen, which was pretty effective, is the chambers get together and they do that Gorge Nights, both in Salem and Olympia, all right, where they get as many of the legislators together to promote the gorge. And you've got the breweries, you've got the fruit industry, you've got the wineries, the tourism, the hotels. Everybody shows up at that, and that's a very positive thing. But again, that's a once a year situation. And I think that the other difference is, I think Oregon spends $34 million a year on tourism promotion, and Washington spends,
I think they got 1 million or 1 million.
oh, they got $1 million last year.
But it's first in many years.
Yes.
Washington's the only state in the United States without a statewide tourism. But they do work closely together, and Mary Ann can probably say that Travel Oregon funded a big initiative that went on for a long time. Now, what was that called? Oh, and Lynn, you were involved in that.
It was one of the tourism councils they did around the state, and there was actually special grant money given so that it could cover both Oregon and Washington.
Right.
And that's what led to the Skamania Gorge Visitors Association effort to be combined.
Exactly.
I don't want to steal someone else's question. I think I do have another one. Well, I was just thinking about Scott's comments around the changing demographics in the next 10 years and diversification and a greater increase in SAM population. So I just wondered if there was anything that the county is thinking about with regard to entrepreneurship and developing some businesses and staggered houses and startups, especially those that are minority-owned businesses and entrepreneurs to make it a place where they want to engage and want to start a business. That will also create some momentum.
I can take a stab at that. We have started looking at that, and well, I shouldn't say we've started. I mean, we are working on it. And, we work really closely with Mid-Columbia Economic Development District because they have the 5-county region within the Gorge. And so they really are our regional economic development agency. And with them and amongst the other economic development partners, we have specific resources for just that. Again, the resources are limited, but we do what we can to promote our business loan programs and make sure that we reach those people that might need it the most. And we're always trying to engage the business community in new and fun ways. Last night, the EDC held its first of 2 pub talks, and we had a fun event at the end where everyone got to go try out the Segways and electric bikes that were there from a business that was talking about some new things that they're providing in the community. And so it's really, I mention that as a way for our community members to engage with one another, for businesses to network. And for us, it's huge because as a really small business in the Gorge, it's tough. And most business owners work 14 to 16-hour days when it comes down to it. And to have them have an opportunity to network with other owners and other business people really helps them out and creates that community engagement that we're looking for. So we're really trying to do more of that. We partner a lot with the Chamber of Commerce and also with the port to do those kinds of fun things and to really let the businesses know that we're supporting them in any way that we can.
I think one of the things we're seeing too is, well, Scott can go into the details, but the largest employer has always been government services. That's been in decline. The increase has been in the service industry. So we're replacing what would be considered higher wage jobs with all the benefits with a lower wage type of job, but with a lot less benefits if there are benefits. So we really need to have a diverse economic base, but we're pretty much dependent on one or the other. We don't have anything in them, or we have some in the middle, but it's just not enough. And he mentioned how a residence doesn't actually provide enough tax base for the services that it's required. And the city of North Bonneville has only residential. Well, there's 2 little businesses and a golf course that employs 1 person. So, and that's our second city in the entire county.
Well, they just lost the hotel.
Yes,
Sorry, and I didn't mean to imply that entrepreneurs of color are only going to make service industry. There are other things.
Right.
In the integrated sector that
sure.
Sorry for not clarifying.
Hi, so I would like to thank Even for all of her great work on this article and our panel from coming all the way out here from Skamania County and the people that they brought with them. I don't think, except for being in Skamania County, I've ever been in the same place as so many Skamania County residents before. So this was wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and share this with us. And I'd like to thank everyone, excuse me, who came today. There is a sign-up sheet in the back. If you haven't already signed in, we would love to have your name and email address so that we can share with you when this video is posted online and also future events that we are having. Thank you.